So we're going to do, hello, sorry, hello. We're going to do landscape maintenance. This is for our Thursday lecture. So let's get started. So landscape maintenance. So the goal in landscape, when we do our landscape design, uh, we always have to think about the maintenance that design is going to require. So we want to reduce complexities overall. So for example, you want to make sure that there is like for example veggie beds or planter beds, that are going to have plants in them, have access so that people can get in there and do weeding or pruning or watering or any other type of maintenance they might need to do. So that's a really important thing. So the first part is just simple access. One of the things you want to have in your design is in mind when you're doing your landscape design is how are people going to take care of this? How are they going to get in there? And that's access. The next thing we want to think about, besides the access, physical getting around to the places, and that can be as simple as just making paths, leaving open areas, is also to think about the size of your plants. Okay. We don't want the plants to get too big for their spots because when this happens, this incurs more maintenance. Like I was telling you guys, the the trees planted under the power lines in front of Winco in that area, just down by Bear Valley from the college. That's not a good design. The people weren't paying attention. Likewise, too small plants. Let's say you have too much open ground or bare ground. That's going to increase the possibility for weeds. Okay, so you want to make sure you're using up the space as much as possible, but also not overcrowding it. And that's an important thing. That will happen basically by you researching and figuring out how big your plants are. So those two first things. So one was, remember, access, just having enough room or having a plan so that whoever is going to maintain this can actually maintain it. And also that goes into not designing an overly complex landscape. And two, making sure your plants are the correct size for the area. Now, the amount of maintenance on a landscape varies depending on the use of that landscape, right? And so some landscapes or some parts of a landscape, excuse me, can be have more maintenance than other parts. Good example being a lawn. Now, we are not against lawns at all. We're just against excess lawns, but lawns do serve a purpose. They're a great place for sitting, laying activities, physical activities of kids and things like that. But a lawn is typically a higher maintenance than would be a bed of shrubs and perennials and stuff. That would be a lot less maintenance. So just being aware of that some areas are going to need more. Now, on the echelon of maintenance of what types of gardens need the most, it's not so much based on the style of the garden, though that can have an effect. For example, like a garden where the style is very refined and the hedges are clipped into shapes, or like bonsai where the plant is being trained. Those have that's a lot of work to do those things to maintain those plants. Other plants like cactuses, succulents, some native plants, very minimal maintenance. But let's go through some categories of just kind of basic maintenance on who's more and who's less. So at the top of maintenance, as who needs the most, would be something like a vegetable garden. And vegetable gardens aren't inherently a lot of work. It's just that you want to get something out of it. So to do that, you have to put in work. You have to harvest. You have to weed. You have to water. You have to fertilize. And they're generally the part of your landscape that requires the most input because you're making food, especially in our climate Southern California, it's going to require, water and fertilizer and protection from the wind. It's going to require that you add compost and fertilizer twice a year, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So, veggie gardens by far the most intensive. After veggie gardens, you'll have your orchards. Um, so basically, your food production is on the higher end, and then after that, you have your lawns, ground covers, vines, and then trees and shrubs. Now, trees and especially trees get a bad rap because you hear a lot about their maintenance because their maintenance is expensive. It's not that they need more maintenance than other plants. It's just that their maintenance can be expensive, and it's something you kind of have to do. Remember, a tree can kill you. It falls on top of you, it will kill you. Fall on top of somebody in the wind or whatever. So remember that. So vegetable gardens, orchards, lawns, ground covers, vines, and then trees and shrubs are the very end. Now, the reason why ground covers and vines are more maintenance than trees and shrubs is, for example, on a vine, you have to not worry, but you have to make sure it's climbing or attaching correctly. And you want to, sometimes with vines, they're very rambunctious. You want to make sure that they're not um, twining and going on places they're not supposed to. Ground covers are slightly more maintenance because some of them need more pruning, and also they can collect trash and things. So I think succulents and cactus are kind of a problem for this, especially cactus. Trash like dried leaves gets blown into their spines, and sometimes it can be a mess, and so it's more maintenance. So they're a little bit more maintenance than a tree or shrub would be. And then of course grass. Now this is just general lawn maintenance. And now when we're doing a landscape design, our goal is to try to minimize the maintenance. Most people want lower maintenance because it's what everybody needs. But there's no such thing as no maintenance. So the things I discussed just now previously are things that happen all the time. Can't really get out of it, right? If you're going to want edible plants, you're going to have to work for them. You want grass and stuff like that. Yes, you can have a very low maintenance garden, but a no maintenance garden is basically letting nature do anything. So that means you're not doing anything to it. And that will take your control over that landscape also goes away as well because you're forfeiting that control over to nature because you're not doing anything. But so that's not something that is really practiced in landscape design. It can be. It's interesting to think about like a super native design where all the plants are native to that site, which would require very minimal maintenance, but it would still need maintenance to be not only look nice, but maybe for safety reasons. Maybe plants are growing where they don't necessarily need to be and things like that. So there's no such thing as no maintenance, but definitely low maintenance. There is low maintenance. Like I said, veggie gardens, orchards can be pretty low maintenance. Even though they're pretty high up on the work list, they're not horrible unless you have a lot of fruit trees. But veggie gardens definitely are work. So we're not going to include veggie gardens in that maintenance. We'll talk about that separate. And we have plenty other classes that we talk about veggie gardening. So we have food production class, agriculture science, agronomy classes where we will teach you how to plant what vegetables and what. Our permaculture class in the summer, in the spring. Every spring we have a perm class. We go real heavy into vegetable production. And in the summer, they have a vegetable gardening class, which is a lab. And when we go back to class, you can ask me the names and I'll give you the names of the classes. I think they're like AGNR 60B and C, but I'll let you know if you're interested in those. Typically, I know the one in the summer, which is happening right now, which is what Dakota's teaching. It's a 1-unit class, but then we also have another 1-unit class in spring, which is that perm class. I believe it's 64D. anyhow, interested in that, let me know. That, because of all the intricacies in growing vegetables and harvesting of vegetables and the processing, and that's all going to be separate. We also deal with fruit trees too in those two classes. So if you guys have questions about maintenance on fruit trees and orchards or veggie gardens, just let me know in the class next week, and we'll go over those. And that's important too, because some of your designs you're gonna want that in there. But what I'm going to talk to you right now is what I would give customers, what I've given many people and customers of mine, kind of a generalized set of instructions. And I don't write them down so much because they're too variable for place to place. But these are generalized instructions, and I will give you to them on a PowerPoint next week. But for now, it's we're on YouTube, so you can go over and over this over and over and listen to what I'm saying. So this is a generalized low maintenance schedule for all of Southern California. So we're going to kind of stay kind of local to Southern California. And these are kind of goals and kind of best management practices. Actually, they're more best management practices than goals. So if you were to stick on the schedule that I'm going to talk about, you or your client will generally not have as many problems if they stick to this maintenance schedule. But it does require that you stick to it. So again, it's not zero maintenance. So if you stick to these maintenance schedules, it becomes low maintenance. All right, so let's talk about the schedule. It's very simple schedule. We don't want complicated stuff for people. And also, when you're running a business, let's say you're maintaining different properties, you need a simple. You want to make it less complicated for you and your workers. Okay. So one way to think about that is to do the work seasonally. And I'm a big proponent of that. Even though we don't have 4 seasons here, pretty much Southern California, some places do. But I know a lot of places don't. We're kind of, 2-season climate. But it's for maintenance wise, we still have 4 kind of garden seasons: summer, spring, fall, winter. So we're going to break the calendar year into 4 quarters. So everything is going to be done. All this maintenance will be done once a quarter, 4 times a year, which is every 3 months, once in 3 months, right? Once in spring, once in summer, fall, winter. And each of those seasons / quarters is 3 months long. One nice thing about going with that stuff is that you every 3 months, if you're out there looking to do maintenance, right, you have to go out into the garden or out into the landscape every 3 months, and you survey that space every 3 months. You're going to catch something before it gets to be a big problem. Good example is pruning. Okay, let's start off with that. So instead of pruning once a year or twice a year, pruning 4 times a year, every 3 months, once a season, spring, summer, winter, fall, we're always going to catch something that needs to be pruned. Because all these different plants, some of them grow at different rates, they're doing different things. Not everything is going to be all at the same time. So doing that, when you're going to go to the garden, for example, first day of spring, you show up to your garden, you look around, and you're like, okay, this is the stuff that needs to be done. This stuff will be, you'll also look at stuff that will be ready in the future. Like you'll see some plants that are blooming really heavily, and you'll be like, okay, these rose bushes that are blooming really heavily now and have a lot of flowers. Well, in 3 months, most of those flowers will be gone, dead. I'm going to have to deadhead, which is remove those dead flowers. So it's kind of like what to do now and what do I see for the next quarter. So doing it quarterly is really important. Pruning example. And then that means you're doing pruning a little bit all the time, not all the time, but more often than having to do really big pruning jobs all at once, where it's a real big mess. Same thing with weeds. Oh my God, weeds are the worst. So you have to address weeds quarterly, or else it becomes a big issue. So the quarterly, the once a season, I love that because most calendars, if you have a calendar, tells you the first day of summer, the first day of winter, the first day of fall. And if I usually just follow those calendars and do it at some point, whatever those months are. So they're March. So March is a good garden month. The next one is that's for spring. June for summer. September for fall, and December for winter. So March, spring, June, summer, September for fall, December for winter. Those months are pretty good because, for example, you prune in spring, you're going to prune any dead seed heads, any things that died over the winter, get rid of them, make it nice and clean for those plants to look good in the spring. Anything that you prune in the summer, you're going to be deadheading all those dead flowers that were blooming in the spring. In the fall, you'll get some dead branches, dead leaves that died during the summer. And then your winter pruning is basically shaping and cleanups. So keeping a active pruning schedule like that 4 times a year is really important. Weeding the same way. March, you're going to get those really early, small, early season weeds. Really important to get those before they get big and reseed. You don't want them to get big and reseed. Again, June, you're going to be picking out the summer weeds when they're really small. Again, June is when their summertime weeds are just starting to grow, getting them out before they start to seed. September is kind of maintenance, right? Our September is kind of warm here in Southern California for most places that are below 4,000 feet. And in the Mojave Desert, it's pretty still warm in September. It's summertime, but it's more like maintenance, making sure those things don't come back. And then, of course, October, sorry, not September, October, I misspoke. December, for wintertime, you're getting the winter cool season weeds right when they're small. So it's important to do the weeding and pruning uh, those quarterly too, because it minimizes the work in general. And over time, you keep on doing this over and over and over and over, year after year after year. You really, really get ahead on those weeds, and your plants, since you're pruning all the time, start to look really nice because you're not making giant, big cuts. You're not doing major haircuts like I need a major haircut. Instead, you're getting little cuts all the time, so it looks nice. If you could get a haircut like once a month, it'd probably be about right instead of having to wait like every 3 months, right? You get a little shaggy in between. So it just makes sense. And with weeds, it kind of goes into like pest management, IPM. So weeds are part of pest management, weeding. When you weed and you prune, you're also in that landscape around the plants at that time. You should also be looking for any potential pest issues. Do you have any insect problems? Do I have any disease problems? Right? This is a chance for you to be out in your landscape and be kind of intimate in there and see what's going on. So that's a good thing as well. You're doing that quarterly, 4 times a year. That's your IPM. That's looking at your pests. So weeds and pest control, and then pruning as well. So pruning, weeds, pest control, all done quarterly. It doesn't mean it has to be done the same day, but in the same time, usually that same month. Okay. Another thing that works out well if you are doing lots of landscape designs and planting in the grounds is fertilizing. So I like to tell my customers, and I like to design my gardens to have fairly minimal fertilizer inputs. And that means basically sometimes twice a year, which would be a fertilizer application in the fall and then one in the spring. If you have for example, a lawn, an orchard, a veggie garden, or let's say a flower bed that's just got a lot of plants in it, requires extra nutrition, I would recommend a maximum of about once every 3 months, once a quarter, once in the spring, once in the summer, once in the fall, once in the winter, fertilizing your beds. Um, that's not needed for everything. Most landscape plants will be fine once or twice a year, right? Spring and fall. Remember, the more you fertilize your plants, the more they're going to grow and the more water they will need. You don't want to over fertilize them because they will be more prone to diseases. They'll be less drought tolerant and also weaker plants for wind and cold and things like that, heat stress. So you don't need too much fertilizer. So the most you'll ever need for plants in the ground, is about once every 4 months. Sorry, it's once every 3 months, which is 4 times a year, or I would say twice a year, once every 6 months. Now, some plants don't need fertilizer in the ground. Many don't. California natives don't need any extra fertilizer, if they're planted in the ground. Cactus and succulents, for the most part, don't need any fertilizer when you put them in the ground. Right? So those are two groups of plants that you may not need to fertilize. Some really drought tolerant plants don't need a lot of fertilizer. And again, any plant you don't want to get too big, don't feed too much. All right. Now, a big exception to fertilizing 4 times or twice a year is containers. You have any type of plant in a pot and a container out of the ground. That volume of soil is very low, and it's going to require additional nutrients pretty frequently, because every time you water that pot or container, it's going to wash out those nutrients. So for container plants, you usually want to fertilize fairly frequently. And it really depends on the size of the container. If it's a little tiny pot, let's say I'm growing like some geraniums in a little 6-inch pot, you might have to fertilize that pot once a month or every 2 weeks or so often. I have fruit trees, my citrus in pots, and when they're fruiting, I have to water them like every 4 days, and I'll fertilize them every other time I water them. So they're getting fertilizer like every 4 to 8 days. But they're growing a lot, and they're kind of biggest trees in smallish pots. So there's more leaf to root ratio, so you need a lot of nutrients. So whereas a little plant growing in a big pot will need a lot less fertilizer. Okay, so remember that. But in pots, you definitely have to fertilize much, much more often because the volume is not there. You just don't have all of the volume in the soil to hold on to all that nutrients. So remember that. And again, what you fertilize is up to you, whether you want to use organic, non-organic, liquid, granular. I like granulars. Of course, granular organic fertilizer. That's just my style. Mainly because they're safer for your environment and for your employees. Little less likely to burn, though. Organic fertilizer still can burn the crap out of your plants. I recommend, let's say you're doing a customer's yard and there's a lot of different plants there. All purposes are good. All purpose meaning that the little numbers on your fertilizer, the 10, 10, 10, for example, they're all the same. So a 10, 15, 10 would not be all purpose. But remember, all purpose, all the numbers the same. And all purpose is just like it says, all purpose. So a lot of different plants. It's going to create leaves, flowers, and roots in the same proportion. It's not going to favor flower production, favor leaf production, or favor root production. And you can get into all sorts of stuff with plant nutrition about what you want to make your plants do. But for us in this class, remember, it's just to tell the customers, okay, whatever you're going to do, if it's in containers, fertilize once a month. If it's in the ground, we're going to stick to the once every 3 months, 4 times a year, once a season. And remember, so that 4 times a year schedule goes for pruning, goes for weed and pest control, and fertilization, which is all your garden maintenance. Cleaning up can go in there too, right? So that's what I would recommend to your clients, or if you offer maintenance to your clients, which is also kind of fun. Let's say you're going to design a landscape. You can, if you want to kind of expand your business or maybe vertically integrate a little bit, is have some maintenance and say, hey, this is how much it would cost per visit, and we recommend this is what you do, whether it's us or not. And you just want to call it horticulture maintenance or just the maintenance of the landscape. And you want to stress that if you don't do these little basic maintenances on the schedule, you'll actually end up with more bigger, more expensive problems, which will be not as good, not as easy to deal with. Okay. And there's no such thing as no maintenance. Some things are counterintuitive for maintenance. So, for example, gardens that don't have any plants, that are just like, let's say, like mulch or rock, especially rocks, or even decomposed granite. If it's just big expanses of inorganic ground cover without plants, cleanliness becomes an issue. There's nothing there. So every leaf, every weed, when things get out of place, you can really notice it. Likewise, when you have all sorts of different plants, you want to make sure you kind of take into account those plants' needs. What are the maintenance needs of certain plants? Lots of cool plants are amazing to look at, beautiful, but are not really good choices. Really, a good example are bulbs. No hate on the bulbs, but like things like tulips and daffodils. I don't really use them a lot in the landscape because their bloom is so short. They only get like a couple weeks. And some of these things, let's say tulips, in Southern California, unless you live in the mountains, you have to dig them up and put them in the refrigerator or do all sorts of weird things to them to get them to rebloom, right? So you don't want to choose plants that are needy or plants that have high maintenance unless the customer or you really, 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 really want them. Okay, so what makes a good landscape plant is that it performs well, whatever that is, whether that's flowering, producing leaves, or a nice growth form, and that it's fairly disease resistant and fairly tough, not needing tons of fawning over from you, the gardener. And that's hard. That's one of those layers. Besides the color, besides all these other things, that's an extra layer on top of all that you have to think about all the time. Again, one of the harder parts of landscape design is knowing all the plants, knowing what plants to use, how big do they get, what's their maintenance, right? What's their behavior? I always call it behavior. Like, do they reseed a lot? They make a bunch of babies. Are they weedy? Right? Do they have like an ugly season? Things like that. So, like, for example, California natives, some of them are kind of ugly in the summer. They're low maintenance. They're very low maintenance. You don't have to do anything to them. Not a lot of water, not a lot of anything. But they might be a little brown, a little toasty in the summertime when they're naturally asleep. So knowing that, okay, so you're not going to plant those plants with other plants that have completely different growing conditions. Let's say like tropical plants that are going to want a lot of water during the summer and they're going to be growing their heads off in the heat. California natives are going to be asleep. So if you put like California natives and like plants that need a lot of water, of course you're going to have maintenance issues. Plants are going to be getting diseases, not growing right, stuff like that. So again, a lot goes down to plant selection. The size, it's in the right climate. Is it what is that plant's actual maintenance in a garden setting, right? Not in a natural setting. Remember, we're not doing restoration habit. We're not really, you know, we can do ecological restoration, but that could be one of the functions, but it still requires maintenance. So when you talk to our interns that do like the native plant seeds for the BLM, weeding, oh my goodness. Weed. It's like the biggest thing. And if they don't do it every 3 weeks, they get really far behind to the point where they can't do their actual work, the work they need to do. So it's a big deal. And that means if it's hot, if it's cold, they still got to go and weed because it has to be done. Think about that in your garden. So maintaining that schedule of that 4 times a year, every 3 months, kind of keeps it manageable. And it makes sense. It's broken up into chunks, and people can say, okay, what are we going to do in spring? And here's what your list is, and stuff like that. So pretty much all the maintenance is done once every 4 months, once a season, 4 times a year. Exception being like fertilizing and watering, fertilizing being more in for pots. Now watering, I try not to give a schedule, a general schedule. I will give my customers a schedule specific to their site. But like if you say, hey Carlos, how often should I water this orange tree? I'm going to say you're going to water it as often as when it needs it. Because if I give you a schedule and you say, okay, water it every week, and you just water it every week, that's the schedule, right? That plant might get too much water sometimes and not enough water sometimes because the weather is going to change, right? It's kind of like asking you, okay, you want to eat, you're only going to eat breakfast at 8 o'clock, you eat lunch at 12 o'clock, and dinner at 5 o'clock, and it's never going to change. That's your schedule every day, whether you like it or not. You won't be happy. You want to eat when you're hungry and not eat when you're full. And soil, the health of the soil, the fertility of the soil on site can vary drastically. So if you have a good fertile soil, that makes all the world, and you won't have to fertilize that much or water that much. So again, remember soil tests. This is why soil tests is really good, so that you can know going in what the maintenance is going to be like. Is this going to be a lot of fertilizer? Is this going to be high demand fertilizer? Maybe you're not going to choose plants that are more adapted to it. Now, what's cool about the plants, though, is nature has solved all the issues, and there's plants for all sorts of different things. So you want drought tolerant, you get drought tolerant. You want low nutrient, you get low nutrient. Hot sun, you get hot sun. It's a matter of just researching and finding those plants. And I'll talk more about good choices that later on that we can use. All right, so maintenance, 4 times a year, right? Once every 3 months, once a season. That is March, June, September, December are the good times to do the maintenance. And that, what are those maintenance? Those are pruning, IPM, integrated pest management. That's what the IPM stands for. Fertilizing, right? And also general cleanup and checking of irrigation systems. Now, there's a special thing on irrigation. I recommend that all irrigation systems be checked and, if need be, cleaned out early spring. Okay. And this is when you're least likely to need that much water. Early spring is the time of year where your water demand is fairly low, but it's right before that water demand starts to go up. So late winter, early spring, do a audit of the sprinklers, check them, make sure everything's in working order. That way, if something is broken and you have to fix it, and the sprinklers don't have to, can be off for a period of time without hurting the plants. Whereas if you have irrigation turned off in August, a week or 2 weeks in irrigation is a big deal, right? Because of unless it's an emergency. So make sure you think about that. All right, let's give you some tips on some maintenance strategies for all landscapes, especially for us here in Southern California, especially for our deserts. The biggest one I can't stress enough is mulch. Mulch. Organic mulches, inorganic mulches, it really doesn't matter, but mulch your ground. No bare ground. Bare ground's fine for paths, right? But not in the beds, okay? There's many reasons. One reason is mulch reduces weeds. Mulch reduces the amount of water needed. Mulch will keep the ground temperature from getting very high or very low. So mulch has many benefits into benefiting your soil. Plus it decomposes. I love to use an organic mulch like bark chips or shredded bark or something like that. So it decomposes slowly over time and enriches that soil, makes it softer, better. Mulch also, importantly for us in the desert, is important for infiltrating water. So when it rains, that water doesn't just run right off. It kind of stays put and gets a chance to soak in. Okay, remember, your water harvesting, every landscape design in the Mojave Desert is got to be water conscious for the first thing, right? What the water is going to be like? How are we going to save it? Okay. And that's just how that goes for water. All right. What else for maintenance tips? Think also about maintaining surfaces, right? You might have to stain wood fences, stain wood patios, stain cement, right? Especially things made out of wood are going to require maintenance. And I would recommend that, every 2 years or so, you check it out, maybe do some sanding and restaining on wood, stuff like that. Cement, bricks, you don't have to do it every year, but you should go out and look at things and give them a good scrub and spray down every now and then. And again, this depends on, your client and what the look is you're going for. Other than that, your maintenance is pretty straightforward. It's a lot of work, but there's not a whole bunch of things to do. Now, remember, if you design it right from the beginning, it will be a lot less work. One problem I see many people do, and I see this all the time in a commercial setting because they're trying to make money, is too many plants, right? Just too much. Even if the plant is the right size for the area, they pack them in there way too close together, in my opinion, many times. And that makes a lot of problems. Okay. Plants growing into each other, a lot of pruning and maintenance issues. Another problem I see is this with irrigation. If water is being sprayed where there's no plants, other plants are going to grow. That's what nature does. Those are going to be weeds, most likely. So the water should only go to the plant, to where your plants that you want are. There shouldn't be any runoff. Shouldn't want to make sure sprinklers aren't messed up and spraying funky into some other place, right? Because if that water is not getting to the plants, somebody else is going to get it. And that's not good. So you want to reduce your weeds. And mulching. What else for maintenance? Big trees, definitely need to have them pruned by an arborist. I would recommend that being checked out maybe once a year, every other year, so that a certified professional who knows what they're doing, not just somebody who says, "Oh, I'm going to cut your tree to make it look like a bonsai," but if you have a big old tree, someone who actually knows, okay, to keep this thing alive, should probably be called out to a big tree every 1 to 7 years, I think. Maybe a little sooner. I wouldn't go every year unless you have issues, or if it's a tree that's like got problems or super sensitive or whatever. Special tree or old tree. But generally every couple years, like 4 to 8 years, 4 to 7 years, I would recommend having arborists come out and prune out big trees. And the reason why they have to do it is because getting climbing in and the insurance and all that stuff. And that's why you shouldn't plant trees that are too big, because it might be a pain in the butt for maintenance. Remember scale, not getting plants too big. One of the big problems with big plants is they're harder to maintain, right? We could see that on something like a cactus. A lot of my customers planted little cactuses, and then they're like, wow, these things grew into monsters. And there are a lot of maintenance, like an agave, a big giant spiky agave. If you let it go and all of a sudden it starts to come into your paths and stuff, and it starts escaping, it's a lot of work to pull it out, right? A lot of work. So you want to make sure you're keeping a good tap on that. All right, Al, what else do we have to talk about by maintenance? We're almost done. And there'll be a couple more videos about different things. This is just on maintenance. You don't want to make problems. You don't want to bring weeds. So you make sure that you're not, this is big, especially in the Mojave Desert. Make sure you're not planting invasive plants that will become weeds. I have done this myself by accident in the past, and it's no fun having to pull up I had this one bush and it just started reseeding everywhere, and I had to pull it all out. A lot of work. It's no fun. So And I was young at the time. I wasn't know what I was doing, probably like 10, 12 years old. But before you buy these plants, check on them. Make sure they're not on a weed list or invasive plant list, right? Make sure they're not, bully plants are going to take over. They're going to escape. Lots of problems in the Mojave Desert with plants that have escaped and have caused issues. It's weird. Think of things like tumbleweed. Tumbleweeds, which you guys know in the desert, those were brought over as landscaping plants. Somebody that those are pretty. And they're like, oh, I'm going to put this in my garden, and then it escaped. I think a lot of like half of our really bad weeds came from people on purpose. The other half came with animals and animal feed and stuff like that, livestock. But a good deal are in nurseries. A big one that I can't stand is Texas feathergrass. Stipa tenuissima, I think is what it's called. Man, it reseeds all over. It's pretty. People love it. And I'm seeing a lot less of it in the nurseries, but I still see it for sale sometimes places. And it's really not a good plant. And it's so drought tolerant that it even starts to reseed out in the desert. And that's the problem. Then it starts to compete with the natives and it changes the ecology, makes more fire. Not a good stuff. So don't plant invasive plants. Double check your homework. Another thing for maintenance, don't plant big plants. I know it's kind of not so dramatic when you show up to your customers with little tiny things, but smaller plants tend to grow with much less problems than a plant that with the same plant in a bigger size. Okay. So not only you're paying quite a bit more, right? So like a 1 gallon plant's typically priced between $6 and $12. The next size up, 5 gallon plants, it's going to typically run $24 to $49 typically at the nursery. So a lot more expensive. And that 1 gallon plant might grow faster and better and easier than that 5 gallon plant because it's a younger plant, easier to establish. So younger plants, not necessarily smaller, but younger plants are better to establish, and usually younger or smaller. Right. There are exceptions if you need a big tree, if you need a plant to be big, of course, go big. If, like, for example, there's a view over here, I would really want as big a tree as possible to get that view gone or to get that shade. Let's go. So, in my opinion, I don't like to put trees bigger than a 24-inch box. And a 24-inch box is pretty big. 24 inches high, 24 inches wide, in a wooden box held together by metal straps. You cut off the straps and you can plant the whole thing. That's a big hole to dig. It's a heavy tree. It's a two-man job typically. One really strong guy, but 2 men to do it a good job. So planting a 24-inch box is a pain in the butt. Transporting is a pain in the butt. Anything bigger than that, you can't really get. It's a pain. Like 36-inch, 46. That's too big. Unless your customer really wants it. I wouldn't. So my favorite sizes are 1 gallons, 5 gallons, and if I needed something big, I like 15 gallons. With now, real quick, these gallons, 1, 5, 15, the pots don't actually hold those much gallons. That's just what they call them. In the business we call number ones, number fives, number 15s. Or a lot of times there's like 10-inch pots, 18-inch pots, 20-inch pots, 24-inch pots. So yeah, there's different. It's not standardized, which is kind of a pain in the butt, but that's just the way the business is. So make sure that plus bigger plants need bigger holes, staking, right? It's a lot more work. So try to stick with the slightly smaller plants. But remember how big they get. So don't plant too many or don't plant them too close together. Again, don't plant trees or woody shrubs with big roots or big branches within 6 feet. Okay. And I even go further, 6 to 8 feet from paths and houses. Right? You don't want root damage. Some trees are worse than others. Now, The trees that cause problems are shallow rooted trees. So let me see. An example of a shallow rooted tree could be like an ash tree or a um, pistache tree. Cottonwood trees are kind of shallow sometimes. You want deep rooted plants like mesquite trees, palo verde trees, or desert willows. Um, we have ginkgo trees that are fairly deep rooted, and those roots go down instead of on the surface, and those cause less problems. They can get into pipes and they can get into septic tanks, but they're less likely to go hunting for grass and show up to the surface. Okay, so make sure you have that in order. Another maintenance, some trees, speaking of trees, if you cut them down, some plants do this too. If you cut the plant away, they come back from the roots. So just be aware of that too. That oftentimes you have to um, kill the roots or kill the stump. There's different stump killer products. Another important thing, this happens a lot in landscaping. Let's say you had a maple tree that died. My people took it out. We ground up the stump as best as we could, but there's still wood and there's pieces of this tree all over the place. And you're like, I want another one. I want another maple tree. I want to plant it right there where that maple tree is. It's not going to be a good thing. It's like saying, okay, go to sleep with a dead person in your bed because it's another maple. It's like a dead maple tree. It's the same plant. So hygienically, the possibility for disease, it's just not a good thing disease-wise. And that maple tree had already accessed lots of the nutrients in that area that maple trees like. So a new maple tree is not going to find the nutrients that it wants likely there in that spot. So don't plant trees of the same variety soon after taking them down. Right? You can replace the soil. You can wait 4-6 years. I know it sounds a long time, but it works. A different species always helps. And then also not planting right in that hole that you took all the stump out, because that's not good for any tree, because the wood in the ground will start to decompose and use up nitrogen and things like that. All right. So for your portfolio projects, so you have one, the car wash. Okay. Then your next one next week is going to be the public park in Palm Springs and other ones coming. Okay. You're going to start uh, looking. I'm going to ask you to say, okay, what type of maintenance? What do these guys need to do? You can't just say fertilize, prune, trim, because you all have different plants, right? But if there's any certain plants that need a particular type of maintenance, you're going to want to identify that stuff. You're going to want to make sure that, for example, you're not mixing things like California natives with things that need more water. So a lot of times it's real easy just to pick a bunch of plants that look really cool, put them together, like, oh yeah, I like this together. But do they actually grow together? Do they actually play well together? Do they need the same water, the same fertilizer, and all that? So what I'm going to do in the next session, so this session is almost done, is we'll talk about plant groupings, what specific plants that grow well in the Mojave Desert. Remember we talked about guilds back in the permaculture part? In a guild, we plant plants that like similar conditions, right? So similar water conditions, soil conditions, climate conditions, microclimate conditions. So think about that too. So you could take all the microclimates in a landscape, and there's typically many, and you could make kind of little guilds of certain groups of plants that like those conditions. That also have similar maintenance, right? They're not like one is high maintenance and the other one's low maintenance, because that's not going to be good for the person who takes care of it, right? Because most times maintenance is a big issue. It's actually the biggest cost of a landscape in the long run is maintenance, not even installing it. Okay. All right, let's talk real quick about how our two design concepts come in here. Remember the garden room concept and just, which is breaking it up into each room. Remember breaking the landscape into different sections like rooms of a house. Just like in your house, the rooms have different maintenance needs. Your kitchen, your bathroom has different maintenance, more maintenance probably than your bedroom. I don't know, right? So same happens in a landscape. So if you're going to have different garden rooms, remember different uses, like here's the orchard, here's the veggie garden, here's the entertainment area. Consider everything in that area, and you might need to have to make plans for each individual area, right? Like here's what your lawn, pool, patio garden is going to need versus here's what your periphery drought tolerant native plant garden will need, right? So again, identifying that, right? Telling that to the customer very early on. And again, you're going to do this when you give them your design. That's going to be after you present them design and what's the functionality of it. The next thing immediately you do is talk about the maintenance on it. It's a good selling point because if you can sell them this fantastic fun design that you gave them, hopefully they like it, and you can tell them here's how you're going to maintain it to keep it looking beautiful for years, that's going to make them comfortable. And it's supposed to, and it does, because that means you are actually in control. And here you go, they maintain it. Right? If you just say here's the design and you do it and you don't ever talk about maintenance or whatever, problems can arise. That customer doesn't know how to necessarily maintain that yard. And I've done many yards where even if I did tell them, this is frustrating. You do many yards where I go back, a couple of years back, and it looks horrible. No one's pruned it right. They didn't listen. And I would go like, oh, I could tell they didn't have anybody there for months or a year to do any work. And then the best landscape will look horrible. It could look horrible in a couple of years if nobody does it. I mean, it's, and most do. They get weedy and ugly, right? And it's not fun. So remember that. All right, let me think about anything else. Maintenance wise, I guess I could talk a little bit about the fruit trees and vegetables. Fruit trees and vegetables, I also break up into 4 times a year. Vegetables, though, in California, most of your vegetable plants go on a 2 time a year schedule. So we have cool season vegetables and warm season vegetables, and they don't cross, right? And basically in our climate, especially in the high desert where you have such difference between one season and the other, basically it's hot and dry, cooler and moist. So there's plants that only grow in the cool, only in the warm. You only have 2 seasons, which makes picking those plants easy, planting time easy. So vegetable planting times, the big months are in the fall and the spring. Nothing in the vegetable garden, orchard, should be planted after June, in my opinion. It's a little too hot. Everything in the vegetable and orchard needs to be in the ground before June, before the heat shuts it off. And then your planting season starts up again in October. So really it's June, July, August, and September, or July, August, and September, which are really bad, too hot. The rest of the year, October to June, you could garden. There's no way to stop. You can plant plants all winter long, even, unless you live above 4,000 feet. If you live above 4,000 feet in Southern California, you might want to take a winter break because then you're in a snowy, cold place above that. But for us below 4,000 feet in Southern California, garden year round, except for the middle of summer. Right? It's too hot, especially like this year. Too hot, too quick. Let's talk about things that can help your customers with like irrigation. There's smart timers. There's timers that hook up to internet weather data that only water when soil moisture or atmospheric or weather condition. It hasn't rained, for example, in X amount of time, so it's going to put on this much water. That is something that happens often. All right, so this is it for the maintenance maintenance part of it. Remember, think about maintenance. Your car wash design is low maintenance, and so is your next one. In fact, all of them are low maintenance. All right, our next one, we'll talk about plant selection and specific plant groups. All right, thank you guys.